Hey, it's Alex from Last Climb, and today I'll uncover the Everest expedition where these Sherpas knew these influencers were heading straight for disaster. A stupid obsession with brand deals made them believe they could summit the highest peak in the world. And believe me, what I dug up about that expedition and the devastating aftermath it left behind will genuinely horrify you. It was May 5th, 2017, and the afternoon sun at Everest Base Camp was turning the glacial moraine into a wet, shifting mess that soaked through gaiters and pooled between tent platforms. The temperature sat around 30 degrees Fahrenheit. From everything I've heard, it was warm enough to soften ice, but not warm enough to forget where you were. Wind came in bursts from the western CDM, carrying the faint groan of shifting seracs from the Khumbu icefall above. Prayer flags strung between cairns moved in tired arcs, their colors bleached by seasons of ultraviolet. The camp stretched across the glacier in clusters organized by expedition company, each group a self-contained village of nylon and aluminum. Among the dozens of expeditions staged that season were Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway, two Americans who had arrived 10 days earlier on a commercial permit through a Kathmandu-based guiding company. Alyssa was 27, from Austin, Texas, a fitness and lifestyle content creator with thousands of followers across multiple platforms. She had built her audience on gym transformation content before pivoting toward what she called extreme wellness, adventure travel repackaged as personal growth. From what I found, her mountaineering experience consisted of a guided Kilimanjaro trek and a guided Elbrus ascent, both completed within the previous 18 months. Neither required technical climbing. Both had produced content that performed well with her audience, and both had reinforced a belief that high-altitude climbing was primarily a fitness challenge her gym-built endurance could handle. From the research I did on her content leading up to this, everything was framed like she'd already conquered altitude when she hadn't even touched it. Jess was 26, from Portland, Oregon, a travel content creator who had been Alyssa's college roommate. Jess had climbed Kilimanjaro alongside Alyssa, but had no other mountaineering experience. Her preparation for Everest had been a 12-week program designed by a personal trainer with no high-altitude background, endurance running and weighted stair intervals. She was fit by conventional standards, but had never spent a night above 19,000 feet, never used crampons on actual ice, and never clipped into a fixed rope where a fall carried real consequences. I kept coming back to this, 2 Kilimanjaro treks between them. That was the entire resume they brought to Everest. The expedition had been planned as a joint content project. Both women had secured brand partnerships conditional on summit content. Photographs and video from the top that would anchor campaigns for an apparel company and a supplement brand. The financial arrangement meant their presence on Everest was not merely personal ambition. It was a deliverable. That commercial pressure sat beneath every decision they would make on the mountain. I need you to remember that detail. It matters later. Their expedition company assigned Karsang Tendi as lead Sherpa. Karsang was 35, from Tame in the upper Khumbu Valley. He had summited Everest 9 times over 14 seasons, beginning as a kitchen assistant at base camp at 19 and working his way into guiding through years of load carries, rope-fixing shifts, and the quiet accumulation of competence that defined a career in the Himalayan guiding industry. He was not large by Western standards, compact and efficient, with a frame built by altitude rather than a weight room. But believe me when I say this, Sherpas really have superhuman strength, that muscle. Alone doesn't show. He spoke measured English and had a reputation among expedition operators as someone who could manage difficult personalities without creating conflict. He had guided clients who were frightened, clients who were overconfident, and clients who treated him as invisible. 14 seasons on Everest had taught him to read a client's chances within the first week, not through any single indicator, but through the accumulation of small observations. How they breathed at rest, how they ate, how they responded to discomfort, whether they listened when the mountain was trying to tell them something. He had not yet guided clients whose primary purpose on the mountain was producing photographs of themselves. Honestly, when I found out how many seasons this man had under his belt, it made what comes next so much harder to sit with. A second Sherpa was assigned to assist. Younger, mid-20s, 3 Everest summits, quiet and efficient. His role was support, carrying equipment, managing oxygen, and providing a second set of hands on technical sections. The first acclimatization rotation began on May 7th. through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. The icefall was a frozen cascade of shifting ice blocks and crevasses, requiring passage over aluminum ladders spanning open gaps. Experienced climbers moved through quickly, minimizing exposure to hazards they could not control. Alyssa and Jess moved slowly. Both struggled with the altitude transition. Breathing labored at an elevation where supplemental oxygen was not yet used. Jess's hesitation at the first major ladder crossing backed up climbers behind them. Alyssa stopped repeatedly to film. Short clips of crevasse walls, ladder crossings, the chaotic geometry of the icefall. Despite Karsong's reminders that speed through this section was a safety priority, not a preference. They reached Camp 1 in just over 7 hours, roughly 2 hours slower than Karsang's typical client pace. Jess had vomited twice during the final hour. Alyssa complained of a persistent headache she blamed on dehydration. Karsang noted both symptoms and said nothing that evening, but the picture was already forming. And this is the part that gets to me. He could already see it going wrong. The second rotation, to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, confirmed what the first had suggested. Both women arrived visibly depleted and spent their acclimatization nights alternating between forced rest and content production. Their oxygen saturation levels, measured by the expedition doctor, sat at the lower end of acceptable ranges, functional but without the physiological margin that separated climbers who thrived at altitude from those who merely survived it. Jess's readings were low enough to prompt the doctor to recommend additional acclimatization time. In an article I read covering expedition medical protocols, those borderline saturation numbers are exactly where the line between cleared and condemned gets dangerously thin. Karsang raised his concerns with the expedition leader, a Nepali operator named Sanjay, who ran the company from Kathmandu. He reported that both clients were struggling with basic acclimatization, that their technical skills were minimal, and that their pace on the Lhasa face would likely be dangerously slow. He recommended extending their schedule or advising against the summit push. The response came back within hours. Sanjay acknowledged the concerns, but noted both clients had been cleared by the doctor, their saturation was within parameters, and many clients who struggled during rotations performed adequately during the summit push when supplemental oxygen was available. He reminded Karsang that the clients had paid full fees. The conversation was polite, professional, and final. That right there is what frustrates me most about these commercial operations. The guide raises the alarm, and the system just absorbs it and moves on. The third rotation took them to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, a wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees, requiring front pointing on crampons while clipped to fixed ropes with mechanical ascenders. It was the first genuinely technical terrain the women had encountered, and the gap between what Kilimanjaro had asked of them and what the Lhotse face demanded was immediate and brutal. Jess's crampon technique was inefficient. She kicked too many times to set each point, wasting energy with every step, her calves burning through reserves she would need higher on the mountain. Alyssa moved slightly better, but paused frequently, her breathing audible through the wind that swept across the face. Both required direct assistance from Karsang and the assistant Sherpa at anchor transitions, where switching between rope sections demanded coordination they had not internalized. And based on the info and photos I found online, the face stretched above them in an unbroken sweep of blue ice, nearly 3,700 vertical feet from base to crest. And the women were climbing it at a pace that consumed time and oxygen the summit push could not afford to lose. They reached Camp 3 after 9 hours. Most guided clients completed it in 6 to 7. Both collapsed into their tent and did not emerge until Karsang brought water and food to them. Their faces carried the hollow, gray look that altitude imposed on bodies working beyond capacity. Jess spent the night coughing, dry and persistent, a possible sign of early pulmonary edema. By morning, the cough had subsided. The expedition doctor, consulted by radio, cleared her to continue. If you've watched my other videos, you know exactly what that clearance means. To me, it's not a green light, it's a liability transfer. Karsang discussed the situation that evening with 3 Sherpas from other expeditions. A quiet conversation outside the cooking tent at Camp 2. He described the slow pace, the marginal acclimatization, the client's inability to recognize their own limitations. The other Sherpas listened without surprise. One asked directly whether Karsang believed the women would survive the summit push. He did not answer. He said everything depended on weather, oxygen management, and turnaround discipline. But his expression, according to those present, communicated what his words did not. And that part honestly sat heavy with me. The summit window opened on May 21st, 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies. Teams began staging upward from base camp, and the mountain filled with movement. Alyssa and Jess pushed through Camp 2 and Camp 3 over the following days, reaching Camp 4 on the South Col at 2:15 p.m. on May 23rd, later than planned. They settled into a tent on the windswept plateau amid the debris of decades, empty oxygen cylinders, shredded tent fabric, frozen waste, and the silence that altitude imposed on everything. Karsang checked their oxygen supplies and calculated the math that would determine whether they lived or died. Each woman had 3 bottles for the summit push, 1 for climbing, 1 for descent, 1 reserve. At standard flow rates, each bottle provided roughly 6 hours of supplemental oxygen. The round trip typically required 14 to 16 hours for guided clients. The math worked, but only if everything went according to plan. There was no margin for delays, increased flow, or the kind of slow progress both women had demonstrated throughout the expedition. Stay with me here, because from this point forward, the math is driving everything. They departed Camp 4 at 12:45 a.m. on May 24th, 15 minutes behind schedule. Jess had struggled to get crampon straps adjusted in the dark, her fingers clumsy inside thick gloves. Above them, a line of headlamps already stretched up the triangular face toward the balcony, each light marking a climber consuming oxygen and time on the same fixed ropes. The cold was severe, at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, before wind chill, believe me. At that altitude, it was the kind of cold that found every gap in layering and punished any exposed skin within minutes. The climb was steep but manageable on fixed ropes, hard snow, an occasional rock demanding careful crampon placement, and sustained effort in air that held barely a third of sea level oxygen. The climb was slow from the start. Both women moved below the minimum pace Karsang had calculated as necessary to summit and return within their oxygen window. Alyssa held a slightly steadier rhythm, her fitness showing in the consistency of her steps, if not their speed. Jess labored behind, each step requiring a pause that lasted several breaths longer than it should have, her headlamp beams swaying with the effort of keeping upright. Karsang stayed close to Jess, monitoring for the deterioration he expected. The assistant Sherpa climbed behind Alyssa, managing the spare oxygen bottles and watching the line of lights above them grow further away. They reached the balcony at 5:40 a.m., 90 minutes behind pace. Karsang checked gauges and found both women had consumed more oxygen than projected, their elevated breathing rates burning through supply faster than assumed. He replaced their bottles and recalculated. If they maintained current pace, they would reach the summit around 1 p.m., an hour past turnaround. The descent would consume remaining oxygen with almost nothing in reserve. He communicated this plainly, using numbers rather than abstractions. Alyssa asked how many other climbers were still going up. The answer was dozens. She told Karsang they would continue and manage their energy. Jess nodded without speaking, her body language communicating exhaustion rather than agreement. The way I read that moment, she wasn't agreeing to continue. She just didn't have the energy left to disagree. The South Summit appeared at 10:20 a.m., 28,700 feet, more than 2 hours behind. Turnaround. Karsang checked oxygen again. Alyssa had roughly 4 hours remaining. Jess had closer to 3. The summit was 90 minutes above. The descent to Camp 4 would take at least 5 hours at their pace. The arithmetic no longer worked. Karsang told both women they needed to turn around. He stated this plainly, without diplomacy, because at 28,700 feet, there was no time for negotiation. Alyssa refused. She pointed to climbers still moving above them. She argued they had come too far, that others with similar oxygen were continuing, that they could reduce flow on descent. Jess said nothing, standing slightly behind Alyssa, her posture sagging, her eyes glassy and unfocused above the oxygen mask. Karsang contacted base camp by radio and reported his recommendation. The expedition leader consulted the base camp manager, who noted other teams were still pushing and conditions remained stable. The decision came back. Clients could continue at their own discretion. The company would not order a mandatory turnaround. Karsang clipped back into the fixed rope and continued upward. He did not argue further. The system had spoken, and his role within it did not include the authority to physically stop paying clients from climbing. When I discovered that the company relayed that decision from a satellite phone in Kathmandu, not even from base camp, I had to read it twice. They cleared the Hillary step at 12:05 p.m. after a 30-minute queue that burned oxygen and body heat in equal measure. The final summit ridge stretched ahead, a narrow spine of snow with Tibet on one side and Nepal on the other. Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway reached the summit of Mount Everest at 12:48 p.m. on May 24, 2017. They stood at 29,029 feet, nearly an hour past turnaround, with oxygen supplies that could not sustain the descent ahead of them. Karsang gave them 5 minutes and stated the number once. Both women removed brand banners from inside their suits and posed while the assistant Sherpa photographed. Alyssa produced a small tripod and mounted her phone for video, adjusting the angle twice. Jess stood beside her, holding a sponsor's flag, her smile invisible behind her oxygen mask, but performable through posture. The 5 minutes became 10. Alyssa asked for additional shots. Karsang repeated that they needed to descend. Another 3 minutes passed before the cameras were stowed. They left the summit at 1:01 p.m., 13 minutes at the top. Every one of those minutes had been borrowed from the margin that would have kept them alive. Only 13 minutes at the top. I need you to let that land. The descent hit traffic immediately. Climbers still ascending, while summiteers tried to descend on the same fixed ropes. By the time they cleared the bottleneck and reached the south summit at 2:30 p.m., Jess's oxygen was critical. Karsang checked her gauge. Less than 45 minutes remaining at current flow. Camp 4 was at least 5 hours below. Reserve bottle was the last full bottle between both clients. He switched Jess to the reserve and reduced her flow to the minimum that would keep her moving. Alyssa had roughly 2 hours remaining. The assistant Sherpa carried one partially used emergency bottle, perhaps 90 minutes. Between two clients, approximately 3.5 hours of combined oxygen for a 5-hour descent. Below the balcony, at approximately 27,000 feet, Jess stopped walking. She did not collapse. She simply ceased movement, standing on the fixed rope with her ice axe planted, her weight resting against it. Breathing rapid despite the mask, legs trembling. Karsang reached her within seconds and found her unresponsive to verbal instructions. Her eyes tracked movement but showed no comprehension. She had entered the cognitive collapse that severe hypoxia produced, conscious but no longer capable of translating information into action. Believe me, I've covered enough of these to know. Once you see that description, the window is already closed. Karsang and the assistant Sherpa attempted to move her physically, supporting her weight between them, 10 steps at a time, her boots dragging grooves in the snow between placements. The effort demanded enormous energy at an altitude where every movement cost 3 times what it would at sea level. The pace it produced would not reach Camp 4 before dark, before oxygen ran out, before the cold took what the altitude had started. Alyssa descended ahead on the fixed line, her own pace deteriorating as her supply diminished. She stopped frequently to look back, watching the two Sherpas struggle with her friend's weight, her posture shifting between the impulse to help and the physical inability to climb back up. Honestly, no matter your opinion of the two, this is heartbreaking. At 4:15 p.m., Alyssa's oxygen emptied. She was at roughly 26,600 feet, 600 vertical feet above Camp 4. Without supplemental oxygen, deterioration came fast. Within minutes, her coordination faltered, her steps shortening to shuffles. The precise crampon placements she had managed all day dissolving into clumsy scrapes against the snow. She sat down at 4:30 p.m. and did not stand again. And I wish I could say this gets better, but bear with me, it's about to get a whole lot worse. Karsang faced the calculation the mountain eventually forced on every guide who stayed too long. Behind him, Jess was no longer moving under her own power. Ahead, Alyssa sat motionless. His own oxygen was running low, each breath delivering less than his body needed to sustain the effort of keeping 2 dying clients alive. The assistant Sherpa, working without supplemental oxygen for the past hour to preserve supply for clients, was showing impairment, slow responses, unsteady footing, the mechanical movements of a body running on reserves it did not have. They reached Alyssa and attempted to rouse her. She responded to contact, but could not stand. Karsang administered the last emergency oxygen. For several minutes, her breathing improved, but the bottle held less than an hour, and Camp 4 remained unreachable at their pace. Darkness arrived near 6 p.m. Temperature dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind increased to gusts that made standing difficult. Karsong made the decision that would follow him off the mountain and out of the profession. He and the assistant Sherpa began descending toward Camp 4 to organize a rescue with fresh oxygen and manpower. Leaving meant accepting the possibility that neither woman would survive. Staying meant all 4 of them would die. And I think no matter how many times I cover stories like this, that specific moment, where a guide has to walk away from someone still breathing, is the one I can never get used to. He reached Camp 4 at 8:15 p.m. A rescue team of 4 Sherpas from 2 expeditions departed within 30 minutes, climbing back into darkness with headlamps and oxygen. They found Jess first, at approximately 26,800 feet. She was no longer breathing, slumped against the fixed rope, ice forming along the edges of her mask. They continued upward and found Alyssa 200 vertical feet below where she had been left, suggesting she had tried to descend alone. She was seated in the snow, pitched forward over her knees. The emergency bottle lay empty beside her. No pulse detectable through layers. The rescue team waited, checked again, and descended without her. From everything I could find, that team climbed back up knowing what they'd most likely find. And they went anyway. Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway were declared dead on the upper slopes of Everest on May 25, 2017. Both found within sight of the South Col, less than 700 vertical feet from the tents where warmth and oxygen waited. Cause of death for both was listed as hypoxia and exposure at extreme altitude. They were 27 and 26 years old. The bodies remained where they fell. The brand partnerships that had financed the expedition were quietly dissolved. The content they had produced during the climb, weeks of photos and videos, remained on their accounts, where followers who did not yet know what had happened continued leaving encouraging comments beneath the last posts, uploaded from Camp 2. That detail stays with me more than almost anything else in this story. Karsang Tendi did not return to Everest the following season. Colleagues who saw him in Kathmandu described a man who had difficulty sleeping, who avoided conversations about the mountain, who flinched at sounds that carried no threat. He told one close friend that he could not stop replaying the final hours. The descent, the decision to leave, the walk to Camp 4, knowing what he was leaving behind. The assistant Sherpa suffered frostbite damage to several fingers that required partial amputation. He returned to his village and did not seek guiding work. Again, 2 careers ended, and to me, that's the part nobody talks about. The mountain doesn't just take the ones who die. Neither man spoke publicly about the incident. The mountain had taken 2 lives and ended 2 careers, and the silence that followed was its own kind of aftermath.